Hey, FCC family. My name's Aaron, and I'd like to bring a little bit of inspiration for you today. This is Wednesday of Holy Week, and today's devotional thought comes from the book of John, chapter 13, verses 21 through 31. Now, Jesus was deeply troubled, and he exclaimed, "I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me." So at this point, Jesus knew. He'd been alluding to this fact throughout the whole 13th chapter, but he finally blurts it out to his disciples and says in plain speech, "One of you." The disciples looked at each other, wondering whom he could mean. The disciple Jesus loved was sitting next to Jesus at the table. Now, pause for a second. Most people agree that the disciple that Jesus loved was probably John, who coincidentally was the author of this book. And it's not the only time that John refers to himself in a similar way. And maybe Jesus did have a particular love for John that was special in a way that was different than the other disciples. In fact, John went on to author several other books in the New Testament, so there was clearly a strong connection. But this was still relatively early in John's walk with Jesus. He'd only been a Christ follower for 3 years, and it took probably close to another 40 years before he wrote the final book of the Bible, Revelations. And I say all this because even as John is writing his account of the last days of Jesus' life on earth, that we see this maybe just a little bit of pride slipping into the text. John was a human, and all of the disciples were human and prone to human failings. And Simon Peter motioned to him and said, "Hey, who's he talking about?" So the disciple leaned over to Jesus and asked, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus responded, "It is the one to whom I give the bread I dip in the bowl." And when he had dipped it, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. And when Judas had eaten the bread, Satan entered into him. Now it's clear that if we go back to the beginning of the chapter, that Judas had already been thinking about this moment. The devil had already been prompting Judas, but Judas was finally letting it happen. Judas was also human. In fact, we already know from accounts of the disciples that Judas was the treasurer of the disciples and occasionally dip into their treasury a little bit and take some for himself. So it's not a surprise that when the prospect of a little bit of money was placed before Judas, the 30 pieces of silver, that he'd be tempted to take that offer and betray Jesus in that way. But I know the story arc of Judas's life represents my everyday. Every day I'm faced with choices. Is Judas's choice to choose greed over Jesus any different than my choice to choose greed over Jesus? Or to choose lust over Jesus? Or to choose anger over Jesus? Or selfishness over Jesus? Each one is a betrayal. And then Jesus told him, "Hurry and do what you're going to do." So it's clear that Jesus knew what Judas was going to do. And I've struggled with this question a lot. Was Judas chosen by Jesus because he would betray him, or in spite of the fact that he would betray him? Did God have some greater plan for Judas? Did Judas simply not, or did he just simply fail to be the disciple that he was called to be? Sometimes that question bothers me, but I have to remind myself it doesn't really matter. God used Judas regardless of the intent. Did he plan it, or did he allow it? It doesn't matter, but he knew. The disciples, however, didn't know. In fact, they're sitting there confused about what just happened and making up scenarios in their head to justify it. But in verse 31, as soon as Judas left the room, Jesus said, "The time has come for the Son of Man to enter into his glory, and God will be glorified because of him." So it's clear that no matter what the original plan was for Judas, the plan for Jesus was always the cross. God used Judas in his mess to accomplish his will and ultimately display his glory. Now, we can mess up God's plan for us, but we can never mess up his plan for his own glory. He knew what we needed, and he got his victory.